All right, today we are going to review 3.6 through 3.8 of the AP European History course description. Really what we're going to do now is we are going to look at the political and economic changes that have happened in the 1648 to 1815 time period, namely the rise of monarchs to greater degrees of power and the economic transition to becoming a more capitalist economy that is going to come to dominate global trade will lead to conflict. And so if we look at the course description, we will see that the first topic that 3.6 deals with is about balance of power, which really, when you look at the topics that they talk about in there, it's really about war and diplomacy, relationships between states within Europe. Now, big picture, what I think of right away when I see 1648 to 1815 and it's about war and diplomacy, I think about competition for colonies. I think about monarchs trying to expand their thrones and gain greater power. And there is an awful lot of warfare that is fought during this time. All right, so let's take a look at this. So big picture, European states during 1648 to 1815 are going to negotiate and fight with other states to create a balance of power where everyone is relatively, equal and that order is sort of maintained, but there will be challenges to that, obviously. All right, so the first thing we have to realize is that during this time, there's lots of competition, and competitive states are going to compete for resources and power and things like that. Now, in the last time period, 1450 to 1648, religion was a big driver of the conflicts, particularly after the Protestant Reformation and culminating in the 30 Years' War. But after 1648, which is the Treaty of Westphalia, one of those Protestant Reformation dates you need to know, religion ceases to be an impetus for conflict, and now wars are going to be more often fought because of political maneuvering or economic motivations, or sometimes political maneuvering and economic motivations combined, and then also by those seeking to resist changes to those things that have been established. All right, so what we are going to see during this time is that the real big players in European society are going to be those large states that are able to centralize power around the monarchy. And there are going to be 5 big dogs by the time we're done with this time period: Great Britain, France, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. We're not really going to get into the nuts and bolts about those states yet, but they're going to be the 5 great powers that are able to centralize the power of the monarchy to tame the nobles to a certain degree and establish control. And the historical theory here is that the centralization of powers allows a state to marshal its resources best to compete against others to maximize their potential. The great example of one who fails to do this is Poland. Poland at this time is never really able to centralize power behind a monarchy. The nobles are too powerful. And so what we see happening is that the nobles are going to keep power decentralized. And of course, the end result of that is going to be this. Oh, look at that. You guys remember this test question? This is the great powers of Central and Eastern Europe: Austria, Prussia, Russia, dividing Poland up amongst themselves as they squabble over territory and things like that. And so Poland is the great lesson to be learned. Those who fail to centralize, those who don't create absolute monarchy, or at least some system of monarchy and centralized control, will disappear off the map, which is what happens to Poland. Okay, warfare. State and dynastic interests often lead to war, as well as economic interests. So some examples of this that we see in the course description, and let's go back and take a look at that course description, is right here is where I'm talking about. The Ottoman Empire. What we will see is that the Ottoman Empire was a very powerful and expansive state up until 1683, where they are defeated at the Battle of Vienna in Central Europe. After this, the Ottoman Empire is going to cease to be an expansive military power. And really, we're not going to talk about them again until we get to the 19th century, when the Ottoman Empire is sort of falling apart. So the Ottoman Empire, really, we talk about them sort of on the periphery but they are important when it comes to the age of exploration because they control the availability of Asian luxuries, which is the catalyst for exploration in the first place. They are a threat to Central and Eastern Europe, and that sort of culminates right here in this time period when they are stopped outside of Vienna. All right, and so we will return to them. My guess is you're probably not going to see them on a one-question DBQ test, but hey, you never know. Secondly, Louis XIV is the best example of absolute monarch, and as the leader of the most powerful state during this time, he is always going to be sort of trying to figure out a way to enhance his power, enhance the power of his kingdom, and take over territory. And there are a number of conflicts that come about as a result of this. Two good ones, the Dutch War. Louis is going to kind of, explore the borders of France and try and exert control into the Netherlands and control those territories. And the War of Spanish Succession, which is basically where Louis XIV tries to get his grandson crowned on the Spanish throne. And of course, everyone knows if that were to happen, he would then unite those crowns, and all of a sudden you have big, powerful France with access to Spain's colonial riches. And so everyone else said, that's not going to happen. And that's the big point here, is that Louis's dynastic ambitions lead to a coalition of countries, states, that will oppose those ambitions. All right, so that is basically all we need to know for this one here. Yeah. Now, one quick note before we move on to 3.7. Stuff like this drives me nuts right here. Some of you may see Sweden under Gustavus Adolphus. This is during the 30 Years' War. This is in the first time period. It doesn't really fit here, but they are states that benefit from the military revolution. I guess I should talk about the military revolution real quick. Basically, changes in warfare. Hey, there's Missy. Greater uses of gunpowder and movable cannons are going to create opportunities for the states who seize the changing role of war, and so they're going to benefit from that. The Spanish in the New World are a good example of this. France becomes a dominant power because they adopt these ideas, and then Sweden under Gustavus Adolphus, although that doesn't really fit this particular time period. Okay, so let's move on to 3.7. I have a lot more visuals for 3.7. So finally, we get to what we've been talking about, sort of on the periphery. It's the rise of absolute monarchy. Oh. Say hi to everyone. All right, beat it. All right, the rise of absolute monarchy is going to take place. Big picture, how does absolute monarchy affect the social and political developments of a society? That's really what you kind of want to look at. All right. So number one, absolute monarchs are going to have to deal with the nobles, right? We've already talked about how the nobility was often an example of forces within society that resisted the centralizing tactics of the monarchs. And so what they are going to have to do is they are going to have to figure out a way to both placate, but also put in line their nobility. So the goals that these kings want to accomplish, they want to centralize control of the administration of laws, of the financial features of society, of the military, and of religious belief. They want to control all of those things. Well, nobles are often going to resist those things very vehemently. And so some of the things that we are going to see is the removal of nobles from positions of authority that they had previously held. The best example of this is the use of intendants, non-noble people, to do bureaucratic functions as bureaucracies form, as these monarchs centralize their power. And so this is a continuation from what kings were doing in the last time period, taking law and positions of like judicial seats away from the nobility and creating an independent judiciary, or at least one controlled by the monarch, creating tax collectors and not using the nobles to do that, taking military power away from them, all those sorts of things. Another example is the promotion of ministers. The best example of that is Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He is specifically mentioned in the course description. He was basically kind of the father of mercantilism for France's colonies, and he is going to gain this position. and have this influence, and he's not a member of the nobility. He is Louis XIV's personal economic advisor. All right, so what we're going to see, the big thing you need to know about the nobles and the king is that the nobles are going to the kings are going to try to remove the nobles from those positions of authority, taking away powers that maybe they hold in their regions and creating one centralized rule. However, many of the nobles will be placated, although they will lose their political say, their social and economic privilege that they have accumulated over the years will be maintained. And the best example of this is in the form of exemption from taxes, right? That is going to be something that we will see continue up until the French Revolution. Now, important kings that you should know that deal with these sorts of issues. James I in England, right? James is going to face challenges from Parliament and the noble assembly that Parliament is. Also, the Puritans are going to be problematic for James I. Peter the Great of Russia is really going to take away power from his nobility. And then Philip II of Spain is going to deal with those same sort of things. So you should definitely be aware of their names. Those three people are illustrative examples. You don't need to know them all. You just need to know what one of them did vis-a-vis the nobility. And I would say Peter is probably the best one to do for that. We'll talk about Peter a little bit more. All right, so let's talk about the best example of absolute monarchy that we see, and that is the GOAT, Louis XIV of France. So let's go back to our test that we had over this, and let's scroll to everyone's least favorite question. Right there, Louis XIV, the ballet dancer. Patron of the arts. One of the ways in which monarchs centralized power wasn't always through action, but it was more symbolic, right? Patronizing the arts to make yourself look like you are really smart, really sophisticated, all those sorts of things. And so that's what this picture had to do with. But probably another visual that is a good example of what Louis did would be here. The building of Versailles, right? Oh, hey, you didn't think you were going to get to see vacation photos, but never underestimate my ability to bore people with my vacations. All right, and so we scroll through. He built the huge palatial estate and palace of Versailles as a symbol of, look at how powerful I am. Hey, you nobles of France, you think you're so powerful. Well, look at how I'm living. None of your estates, none of the manners in which you live can challenge my wealthiness. This is the most famous part of Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors. Not a funhouse mirror, which I was expecting, but actually crystal chandeliers in a really long row, filled with a bunch of people getting in my way. It would have been much nicer if these fools had, let me have run of the palace to myself, but, people are rude. What can you say? All right, so I really already talked about the things that Louis XIV tried to do. He tried to create administrative, financial, military, and religious control by the king, taking those positions from the nobility and making sure that he had that power. The intendants that I talked about already, these are non-noble people who will be given government jobs, the creation of bureaucracy, the centralization of law and justice, appointing kings who weren't members of the nobility, getting rid of noble courts, and allowing for a more uniform law. All these things are going to be done, and Louis XIV is the best example of that. And then most importantly, the state monopoly of military might, right? Making paid professional armies, not relying on nobles in times of war, but creating a national army. All right, the next guy that we need to talk about is Peter the Great of Russia. Now, Peter is very interesting. He is going to fashion himself basically as the Louis XIV of Russia. And he is going to enter Russia into European politics really for the first time. Prior to Peter, the Tsars of Russia had been relatively weak. They had been under Mongol control at the very beginning of this time. And so we really see Russia emerge under the guidance of Peter the Great. All right, and Peter the Great is best known for Westernization, making purposeful and deliberate attempts to transform Russia politically and culturally to orient more towards the West than to the East. So here's a quote by Voltaire about what Peter the Great did. Oop, I'm on the wrong quote there. Here it is. Peter the Great was allowed to engage several English engineers into his service, as he had done in Holland. But over and above engineers, he engaged likewise some mathematicians, which he would not so easily have found in Amsterdam. Ferguson, a Scotchman, an excellent geometrician, entered into his service and was the first person who brought arithmetic into use in the exchequer in Russia, where before that time they made use only of the Mongol method of reckoning with balls strung upon a wire, an abacus. He took with him 2 young students from a mathematical school, and this was the beginning of the Marine Academy. Peter made himself proficient in astronomy. He perfectly understood the motions of the heavenly bodies as well as the laws of gravitation, while other countries and leaders amused themselves with imaginary theories such as the earth is immovable. So basically what Voltaire is saying here is that Peter was open to Western models of education, particularly those that focused on math and science. Peter, in his early years, traveled incognito into Amsterdam and learned about Western society, and he was very impressed with the power of Western kings like Louis XIV and decided he wanted to do that in Russia. So what we are going to see in Russia is that Peter is going to westernize the nation while also always increasing his power. He is not going to buy into notions of limited government or anything like that, which is popular in some parts of the West, like England. He is going to increase his power and rule as an absolute monarch, but he's also going to push westernization upon his citizens. And so what are some of the things that he does? Number one, he is going to create schools in Russia that are based on Western curriculum, meaning math and science, studying the latest scientific discoveries and promoting math and science to a degree never seen before. He is going to reorganize his military, Western-style uniforms, Western-style tactics, Western-style weaponry, Western-style administration, where you have like a chain of command, a hierarchy within the military. And he is also going to impose Western fashion models on his Russian subjects. Beards needed to be cut off, Mongol clothing was out, cool new Western fashions were in. We are also going to see the importation of ballet dancers from France. And it's really going to become sort of synonymous with Russian society, the Nutcracker, Tchaikovsky. So yeah, I mean, he completely, totally westernizes Russia there. Okay, so now that we've reached the end of Unit 3, we can see the big pictures really emerge. And I would say there's 3 things that could be part of a DBQ from this particular unit, right? 1648 to 1815, big idea number 1, political power, right? The age of absolutism, the rise of absolute monarchs, but there were limitations and attempts to limit the power of the kings through old customs, through the nobility, through various things that had existed before. And so the nobles and other corporate organizations or other people are going to try to resist. For example, here is an example of how English kings faced Puritan resistance in the form of religious struggle, right? Albeit, we have at all times borne with that which we could not amend in this book, the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, yet we must needs say as followeth, that this book is an imperfect book, culled and picked out of that popish dunghill, the mass book full of all abominations. For many of the contents therein be such as are against the word of God, as by his grace shall be proved to you. And this was a petition from Puritans in the English Parliament. This is an example of a place of a state where the kings are unable to enforce their will against challengers. The nobles, the religious dissidents within English society prevent the formation of an absolute monarchy. Other places, we will see the rise of an absolute monarchy. All right, so just to reiterate, big picture number 1, political power during this time, the rise of absolute monarchy, but the challenges from nobles and religious groups or other ethnic minorities that might try to stop that. Issue number 2, capitalism. Ain't it great? Right? Basically, European economy is going to be thriving during this time because of greater market economy practices. Europe is going to come to dominate the global trade network that is taking place. They will colonize the Americas. They will carve out trading networks in Africa and Asia, and this will enrich their societies. We will see greater use of capitalism to allow for wealth and economic growth and things like that. And we start to see ideas like, from this quote, become popular. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. This evolving idea of private property, and I should be able to do whatever I want with whatever I possess. Now, in addition to a greater capitalist economy, we are seeing the imposition of mercantilism in the colonies of the New World as well. So that's another economic thing to keep in mind. And then big picture number 3 is what we talked about today. Basically, war and diplomacy are going to be based upon political and economic motivations. The desire to expand one's power as a monarch will often produce a reaction against that. The desire to exploit economic resources and gain new territories will also lead to examples of warfare and things like that. Okay, so let me see if there's anything else that I want to show. Nope, I think I showed, sorry, I disappeared off screen there. I think I showed everything that I want to. That's all for today. Tomorrow we will look at 4.1, which is going to be about this time period as well. We covered the first half of politics, and now we're going to look at the second half, which is going to be about the scientific revolution, which will then lead to the Enlightenment, which will lead to political changes. But until we get to there, I don't want to say anything more. I'll talk to you guys later.